by way of background, my name is John Kalame. I'm an architectural historian, and I'm trained in historic preservation, and I have a special interest in this piece of the American sort of architectural legacy. To me, this building that we're in right now is actually one of the best specimens of the best chapter in American architectural history. Why this is as interesting as it is, at least to me, we're really like intensified in the process of doing the research. Like I really learned stuff that reinforces so many important things about this. And not that this is at all on our agenda, but as it seems that our whole society is falling apart at the seams, this kind of discussion about public space and sort of like honoring everybody's individual research or needs or intellectual development, it always seems like an important subject to me, but now it just feels like it's like mother's milk. It's like, oh my God, these are the last strands of like this golden age of like something approaching like, secular democracy and everything. So anyway, I just got really into it in the process of doing it. So this kind of library, this particular style is so important in addition to the general idea of the virtue of a free and open secular space where you get to investigate whatever it is that you need to know, because this architecture combines the sacred plan. We're like sitting right now, you and I are at the transept of a church plan, of a Romanesque church. This is the apse. This would have been the apse. The altar would have been here if this was the church, and it's a transept, right? It's two crossing volumes. That's on purpose, and so it's not a church. What is it? It's the sacred library. This is the sacred. This process of listening, learning, asking questions, finding answers once in a while and everything. So this architecture was meant to evoke those associations, maybe subconsciously. And then it adds the key, which is what I'm going to talk about at some length in just a second, of that opening, that arch, is what makes this building the Richardsonian Romanesque. And that's the trademark of this exaggeratedly deep, exaggeratedly wide, large entrance that says architecturally, this is for everyone. There's nobody checking your ID. You can come in, and you're going to come into this sacred and protected space, which is both like entering the cavern of like almost prehistoric, associations, and entering the sacred realm, like the church or the cathedral of learning. Well, this would be an apse if we were in a church. It's the rounded top part of a cross-plan church, and this would be the most sacred part of a church. I'm sure we've all been in churches like that. Usually older churches have this shape. And so this would be sort of like the holiest ground. And indeed, what we have are, in this case, periodicals and reference materials, which is great because essentially, if a Bible, would be like a reference book, I suppose you could say, for a Christian, fair enough. But for the rest of us, if we do believe in that or we don't, something more like the Quoddy Tides of the New York Times would be our place to sort of try to glean some kind of truth from the kind of chaotic mess that is swirling all around us. So yeah, this is sacred space, and this is sacred to an idea of democracy, which I think is quickly leaving us and becoming extinct, which is each one of us with our own desires, intentions, and aptitudes comes to a library to find out what we need to find.
Well, I can't count the number of times that people come inside and say they were drawn in from the street because they just had to see the building, that it was just so beautiful that they wanted to see inside, and would it be all right? I mean, you almost get a sense of the sacredness in their request for permission even to to look around like it's some sacrosanct, space. And that can't be overestimated in terms of the value of this institution, both for what it contains, obviously, but that this is the building that contains it, in my view. And so when people ask, wouldn't it be more practical to build a modern building, easier to maintain, less expensive? Well, those all may be true, but it would disregard the legacy of this particular building. This Peavey Library in any other building wouldn't be Peavey Library. It would be the Eastport Library, but this building is Peavey Library. This building is the building that Frank Peavey built to honor his father, Albert. This building is the building that he conceived to gift to the community of Eastport and the region because it was of great value to him. And I don't want to be the generation that decides that this doesn't matter anymore. Frank Peavey conceived to build the Peavey Library to honor his father, Albert. He went into basically an agreement with the now city of Eastport to gift this library to the community with the understanding that the community would populate it with books. He would provide the structure, but the community would have to populate the library with books, and they would have to do the work to keep it alive. So we're still doing the work. I mean, it's not something I'm ready to abandon, and I'm hoping it's still here 130 years from now, and that's why we're trying to be good stewards of this building, because it means something.
It's different for everybody, and no one needs to know what you're searching for or what you are trying to find out, and you don't need to know what they're doing. But in theory, we're all better off for this process of exploration, which used to be so axiomatic that no reasonable person would disagree. Now, I'm afraid one actually has to say those things out loud with some kind of conviction. Being in this space, like right now, this feels like a sacred space. This feels like, a place that has been reserved for something of the highest importance, which I personally believe it absolutely is. My life is totally altered for the books that I've read. I wouldn't recognize myself without the things that I've found in a library, and I'm sure you guys feel the same way. And so these are transformative spaces, not unlike people went into churches to also be transformed in some kind of more spiritual way. I want to articulate as best I can what is specifically so amazing and important to understand about this style of building. So let me pull back just for a second and say that my remarks are titled the Richardsonian Romanesque because that's exactly what architectural tradition this building sits within. And this would be of low significance, the style and the name of the style and everything, and the persons involved with developing that style, if it wasn't for how conscientiously, how purposefully, how philosophically those architects linked their work, their designs, to principles of democracy and inclusion. Very few architects talk about those things. In general, architects are reliably indifferent to high-minded principles. They're interested in beautiful buildings or what they think is beautiful. The Richardsonian Romanesque was something else. It was very idealistic in a way that I think most of us can still really appreciate, and certainly one can feel appreciative sitting in a building like this. Mm-hmm. So you have this guy who was born with the silver spoon in his mouth. He went to Harvard, he went to the École des Beaux-Arts. He could have just worried about himself, he could have just enriched himself, and he became obsessed with this idea that there is a triumph in the democratic process, and that the library in particular, the university and the library, were the main arteries of our democracy, that's how it breathed and that's how it lived and everything. So I just have to, again, like, you know, kind of give the standing ovation to someone like Richardson, you know, who sort of did not just worry himself about aiding and abetting his own aristocratic set, but actually became terribly interested in the question of the dignity and the potential of every single citizen of the United States. And like all the rest of us, he believed that a library was the place where you could transform yourself by a kind of alchemy from one set of ideas or a class, if you will, to another if you wanted to. Completely based only on your own interest and ambition, with no further hindrances, as you just pointed out. Every single book in the collection is yours. Remember the triumphal arch. That was a kind of twisted thing when the Romans did it. I think we could all agree. But Richardson and his colleagues and followers believed in a different kind of triumph, like the triumph of the democratic principle, that everyone is an individual that can transform themselves in any direction. I mean, you know, maybe that's not strictly true for every single person, but we want it to be true. We'd like for that to be as true as possible. Philanthropy was just getting going. It was a little bit of a crude situation. Obviously, it was not about tax breaks like it is now. It was about individual prerogative. But whatever it was, whether it was guilt or, you know, whatever, you're right. Some of the wealthiest people felt they needed to do something. And I think Carnegie was really sincere in his desire to sort of like give back, since he didn't come from money originally and so forth. So certainly, you know, Richardson as an individual architect made his living from a lot of these very wealthy people commissioning him, but he also wanted to believe, he did believe, that there was a form of grandeur, triumph, and dignity that was owed to the non-wealthy, to the non-aristocratic. And that's why he believed that libraries deserve to be the best buildings we could build, with the best materials, designs, intentions, and workmanship. And that's exactly what we're sitting in now. I mean, this is an amazing building. Everything about it, the curving windows, the carpentry, God, I mean, it's just so, we're so lucky. We don't have a vocabulary to describe the benefits of spending time in a place like this. I mean, somebody has a vocabulary for it, but in general in America, as we've talked about before, we are so pragmatic, I guess, you know, that we think of ourselves as so pragmatic, but it would be the ultimate example of being penny wise and pound foolish, to let go of a building that feels like this and works like this, psychologically and functionally, and replace it with something dreary, drab, and ordinary. We'd be getting the worst deal of the century.
These are buildings that are a priceless part of our history, a tangible part of our history, right? And we can't afford to recreate these. They were built in an era where labor was readily available, materials were not expensive. To do the repair work now is tragically expensive, and it needn't be done if they're maintained. So, for example, if someone were to come every couple of years and point the masonry walls, those walls would last forever, right? You know, you have buildings in Venice and Florence and, you know, Athens that have been there for not just centuries, right? Millennia. They're still there, but they're maintained. But if they're not maintained, if the buildings are let go and the assumption is, oh, we don't have to maintain them, well, little by little, they decay. And then when it comes time to repair them, the expenses they're so expensive. And the other thing is, it's really important that we support the craftsmen that do this work. There aren't that many restoration masons anymore. There aren't that many stone workers that really know. There aren't that many people that can do the work on the slate roofs or do the copper work. And so that ongoing maintenance helps to support those trades and keep them active. And I think that those are critical things. We're going to lose our history if we don't do that. The historic bricks were fired at a different temperature, and a brick is like a loaf of bread. It has a crust on it, right? If you cut open a brick, the outside crust is hard and fairly impervious. The inside is like a sponge or like a piece of bread. It absorbs water, and so that's one thing to keep in mind. Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is traditionally the mortar was weak, and it had a lot of lime in it, which made it set up relatively quickly. So it had to be worked with. So you see old pictures, you see guys carrying around the hods, right? And the masons standing there and putting the mortar on, and then more hods and more, because it had to be worked quickly. And it was not as strong as contemporary mortar. So what would happen is, if you got water in the wall somehow, the mortar would pop out and the brick would stay intact, which is important because you don't want to lose the crust, right? If you put modern mortar with historic bricks, the mortar is stronger than the brick. So if you get water in, it works on the brick, and the face of the brick will pop off, which is called spalling. And then the brick is a sponge, and you get, the damage happens very, very, very quickly. So if someone who isn't familiar with working with historic mortar and historic masonry, if they just use new mortar, they're going to ruin the wall, right? They're not going to help it, they're going to ruin it. That's one of the first things. The second thing is, because the mortar's soft, it has to be looked at fairly frequently, and any loose mortar has to be removed and replaced with new mortar. So that's what they call pointing, right? So, but most people look at a brick wall and say, oh, it's a brick wall, you don't have to do anything about it. And then you have these little issues that ultimately build up, and then you have spalled bricks and mortar popping out. You can buy mortar that's restoration mortar that has more lime in it. It's not quite as hot as the original mortar, although you can get that. There is a company that you can send your mix to, and they will create batches of mortar that absolutely matches what you have now. Bricks now, if you have to replace the bricks, you're going to get a contemporary brick, and that's what you kind of end up with, is a patchwork of contemporary and historic brick in a lot of buildings. There's one piece of it right there. They're gonna have to rebuild that. That's beyond repointing. Repointing is that place where I showed you the mortar popped out.
Part has to be rebuilt.
Yeah. In that case, where the brick itself is so broken, you can break out the pieces of it, but you have to remove the mortar around it.
That's where you have to use the classic restorative mortar.
Yes.
You can't use modern mortar.
Again, it'll be a combination of bricks probably. Really bad spot. This one, if you look at it carefully, you can see that there's sort of a diagonal line where there's a split between bricks. It's like a little crack in the mortar, one on one side and one on the other side. That's a really bad sign. That means that that whole arch is starting to come loose, which you can see that it's doing, and it wants to fall, and that wall above it wants to fall as well. So this is a very serious area. Mortar missing around the brick area, that those areas really need to be repointed, right? Because the mortar has popped out. I just see these buildings as, like I said, they're priceless. They're not replaceable, and if we don't preserve them and rehabilitate them, we'll lose them. And I don't think it's a good idea to lose it because we can't recreate it. It becomes a real community center. I mean, people that, maybe they come in here and they read the newspaper. They come in here and read magazines that they wouldn't subscribe to and they don't want to read online, right? They come in here with their kids to have access to, children's books for little children. And then there's all the programs that go on here. There's reading circles, and there's arts and crafts programs, and there's educational programs for adults. And it's the perfect place to have that kind of thing, right? The history of the town is here too. They've got archives of information from 100 years ago, 150 years ago, right? So it's the heart of the community in a lot of ways. This was such a little gem, right? It was almost the shape of a little basilica, right? With the apse and the cross, with the cross wings and all of that, And so it's like, how do you add on to that? And so the only thing I could think of was like a baptistry. That was the analogy. So that's how I sort of saw that the children's wing edition was like a baptistry on the cathedral. The window was part of the original library. It was in this wall here, and we didn't want to lose it. So we made sure we added that as part of the transition from the original library to the new library.
I can open this.
I've watched kids reading, and they like to really literally curl up with their books, and it's kind of nice for the moms can sit in there too and read to them. So that was part of it. Then the other niches were for computers, when we had a lot less computers, and we put them in here so that they could get a little bit of privacy. And then the other shelves were pretty much movable, right? So they've moved them in different configurations based on what worked for their programs. But the stacks, again, were to somewhat replicate what we have in the big stack section of the adult library.
Is Jake safe?
I knew these little niches would be, popular. In fact, they've had to replace the upholstery a few times because, the kids, they can sit in here and read, right? And so they put some of the books that might be appeal to early readers, and yeah, there's always somebody sitting in them.
There's not one here yet. I guess it got ripped off, but that's okay. You can just attach that.
Those I am.
You know, Elizabeth Ostrander's art here too, you know, hanging from the ceilings, the mobile. And then that sculpture, that's one of the original sculptures. You know, there's things that have been here for years that we didn't want to lose, so we kept them.
An actual book. Do you want the book?
The perfect American architect in a way. I think he genuinely loved and believed in the cause of public institutions.